I couldn't help but notice a key character in that meet cute is Florence Nightingale, who is, of
Yeah,
course, a real person.
yeah.
So I'd really love to know, just to kick things off, how did you go about portraying Florence Nightingale? And did you always know she was going to be in the text, or did you make that decision as you were researching her?
So I knew she was going to be in the text just because she played such an integral role at Scutari Hospital, which is where the book is set initially. Midway through the book, well, they're in Scutari slash the Crimea for about the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book they're actually in London. But I like you can't talk about Scutari Hospital and the Crimean War without talking about Florence Nightingale because, as you know, one of the major outcomes of the Crimean War was the fact that that was like the genesis of modern medicine in terms of cleanliness. Like there were physicians who had advocated for it before, like Lister, which I have a whole conversation with him about Lister later, had advocated for the use of carbolic acid for cleaning implements. But before Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War, the practice of medicine, you were as likely to die of infection as you were to die of the surgery. So she's such an integral part. There's no way I couldn't portray her. So I did read all of her correspondence that she had sent back to her funding, to the people who funded her endeavor. I read all of those letters. I also read two biographies of her and some other like contemporary accounts. So she was very much a product of the Victorian era, but then she was not. She was raised in kind of a non-traditional household. She was the daughter, I believe her father was a member of the clergy. So she had an education. They did discourage her from pursuing nursing, though. They said it was not a career that a young woman should pursue.
Mm.
They eventually caved in because she's like, this is what I'm really passionate about. And so, and just like that, portraying her personality and that she was so passionate and devoted to what she was doing, but also very brusque to those who worked for her and with her. Like she was no nonsense. That's what I gather from everything I've read. So.
Yeah, oh, that's so interesting. So that leads me to wonder a couple of things. First of all, you are writing stories across so many different types of the romance genre. Did this story come to you or this series come to you and you were like, oh, I have these interesting dynamics, but I don't know what setting I want to explore? Or did it come to you where you knew that you wanted it to be Victorian and you wanted this book to be about the Crimean War?
It came like I knew I wanted to write a Victorian series, and I've had it planned for a long time. So I have all 7 books planned out. But I knew that I wanted to write about characters we don't often hear about, who because they had their love stories too, right? So I didn't want to
Sure.
write another book about dukes, etc. So so none of my characters are members of the nobility. They might be like wealthier landowners, like in the first book, Thaddeus. He does have a substantial farm. I kind of modeled him after Mr. Martin and Emma, like that kind of a holding. So, but
So
again, not traditional, you know, not the nobility. So
yeah, well, we need a lot less of the nobility.
yes,
And
I agree.
arguably, I would say in real life, the nobility had far fewer love stories than the working class people.
Just on the basis of how many of them there were, right? Because
Yeah, that alone. And then also we know that they were like, living these lives where they weren't marrying for love,
yeah,
whereas the working class didn't have that structure as much.
exactly.
So,
Mhm.
why the Victorian period?
So I chose the Victorian period because I that is when women's suffrage really took off. It is also when a lot of the legal restrictions that were placed on women were lifted that had been there previously. As to property ownership, how they could live their lives. It's also the rise of the middle class as opposed to the Regency period. The Regency period, with the late Regency period, there it was starting to happen a little bit, but the Victorian period, it definitely happened. And the middle class and trades were a different avenue to wealth and to prosperity, and that meant you didn't have to be a farmer. So
Right.
that's the reason I chose the Victorian age instead of the Regency period.
That makes sense. So, would you say you're interested in exploring the narratives of suffragettes or people who were advocating for uh, class change?
I am, and actually, I will be incorporating that into, well, some of it is incorporated in this book. There's this whole discussion they have about Emerson and like self-actualization, like so yeah, I do explore those themes in this book too, but these seven sisters are very erudite, like for their age. One of the sisters like runs the town lending library and she's like writing her own stories. And then another one is an apothecary's. She's the apothecary's apprentice slash assistant. So, you know, I wanted to show how like that suffragette theory had already trickled down to the middle class and this was happening. So
Yeah, that's really cool. You obviously do a lot of research for your
yeah,
books. You've already
yeah,
mentioned quite a
yeah.
few of those. So, how do you incorporate that into your writing process?
So I do an outline, and then based on that outline, I figure out what I need to research, right? So I really wanted my description of the surgeries and the conditions in the hospital to be accurate. So I made sure I researched those things. I actually read this book published in I think it was 1853. It was the Battlefield Surgeons, or sorry, the Surgeon's Guide to Anyway, it was like a surgeon's
An
guide to
actual
doing like
primary
battlefield
text.
surgery. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like a
Gross.
contemporary text. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a medical background?
I do not. I'm an attorney.
So you were researching how they did it back then and then also under trying to learn like, well, what does that mean? How would we understand that
Exactly.
today?
Exactly.
Wow. And so do you find that does that because you write historical, you also
Mhm.
write contemporary because there's so much
And
research that you do
paranormal.
and paranormal. So because there's so much research that you have to do for the historical, do you find that that changes your craft for writing the historical or do they all kind of feel the same?
They all kind of feel the same, but I do write them in different POVs, right? So obviously the historical is third person. Whereas both my contemporary and my contemporary and my paranormal are first person POV alternating,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, female male, female male main character. So, and I do that a little bit in this, but again, it's still from the third person. So,
Interesting. And in terms of, I'm going back to the time period that you chose. When I'm writing Regency, I do a lot of research and I put that into my books, but I also know that most readers who are picking up a Regency historical have some basic understanding of Regency
right,
England. And so
right,
there's a little bit of I don't have to do world building for
yeah,
what is a duke.
yes.
How do you think about building, especially with the Crimean War? Like people have
Mhm.
heard about it, but like we don't really know where is the Crimea anyway.
Yeah.
So, how do you think about the world building aspect?
So that one again, I had to be very particular. Like I have all these maps of the Crimea. like I actually read this really cool book. It's Mrs. Jubilee's journals, and she was one of the women that followed the drum. I actually model one of Fran's friends after her. So she had these really interesting journals. She was the wife of a quartermaster during the Crimean War, and just like the way she talks about the scenes and like the battles and like the setting. So I had to do a lot of research about that, right?
Mhm.
And the same with Fran's from Cumbria. So when she goes back home after the war, I had done a lot of that research anyway because the entirety of the first book takes place in Cumbria. So I'd already done a lot of that research, but that's incorporated as well. And then London, like I have this really cool book. It's like lays out like forgotten places in London, but like there are all these maps of like what Victorian London looked like and where where the hospital that Fran works at and that Nurse Nightingale started was located.